Good morning, Hanukkah Sameach, last day of Hanukkah. We are in the middle of chapter 17, Perek Yud Zayin. We left off in the middle of the story of David and Goliath, David and Goliath. Last class, we introduced with that TED Talk of Malcolm Gladwell. We got our feet wet with the story. We read the first half of the chapter, I would say, talking about, the events leading up to David stepping into the limelight to fight against Goliath, which is where we left off. We talked about some themes and ideas about Shaul's inability to fight, what was going on there. We made a comparison between David and Yosef and some of the brotherly strife that we see in this chapter. And we also noted the idea of Ish, the Milat Mancha, the recurring word of Ish. And this chapter kind of speaks a lot about what makes a quote unquote man. What is an Ish Milchama, a person who's going to fight and bravery and courage. It's not somebody who has the strongest armor or the strongest muscles or the highest stature. It's somebody who's connected to Hashem. Hashem is the Ish Milchama, somebody who has Hashem on his lips. And that's what we're going to continue to see throughout the chapter. So what we're going to read now is from the middle of chapter 17 till the end of the chapter, which is going to discuss the actual battle between David and Goliath, which is not very long, and then some of the aftermath of that as well. And we'll talk about some of the themes and ideas there as well. If you're following in this Tanakh, the Rabbi Sachs Hebrew English, it's page 679, the last line of the page. We're going to start at verse 34, Pasuk Lamed Daled, page 679 of the Koran Hebrew English Rabbi Sachs Tanakh. It's actually the last word on the page, Vayomer. That's where we're going to start. Yes? I'm in this one. Is that the one that you're using? Yeah, page 679, last word on the page, Vayomer. Gotta be in the right booklet. Okay. So where we currently stand is David has stepped up to the plate to fight against Goliath. Shaul rebuffs his initial request. He says to him, "You can't fight this person. You're too weak. You're na'ar ata. You're young." And he's an ish milchama. He's a man of war. Vayomer David el Shaul. David responds to Shaul and he tries to present why he's a good candidate to fight. He says, "No, you're wrong, Shaul. Your servant," talking about himself in humble language, has been a shepherd for his father's flock for many years. It would happen from time to time that a lion or a bear would come and confiscate one of my sheep from the flock. And what would I do? I would defend my flock. I would go out after the sheep, and I would hit or smite the lion or the bear, the predator, and I would save him from his mouth. And the predator would come to try and attack me. I would grab on to its beard or its mane, its hair, and I would smite it and I would kill it. So David is trying to express to Shaul that he has experience in combat against ferocious opponents. David can withstand his own, right? He can hold his own. The lions and the bears I have smitten. This Pelishti, this uncircumcised heathen, this is derogatorily referring to Goliath, will be like one of them. I'll just treat him like a lion or a bear. Because that's really all he is, given that he has cursed out the living God, right? In other words, so David says, this is a guy is an animal. He's a behemoth. That's what I'm going to fight against. I'm going to treat him as such, and I'm going to fight against him the way I fought against all of my other enemies. Referring to the beasts against his flock. Now, what would you make of David's initial argument over here? Seems pretty convincing at first glance, right? But what is noticeably absent from David's words? He does not mention anything about God. This is somewhat uncharacteristic of David. He's kind of touting himself a little bit that he's capable because he wants to try to prove to Shaul, after Shaul told him, "You're just a lad, you're not an experienced warrior," he's trying to attack that claim, right? But he doesn't speak anything about God at first. Interestingly, there's a little chapter break over here, and you could see it in your books. I don't know, you'll notice there's like a space here, little chapter break, yes? And then David speaks again. Vayomed David says, Adonai asher hitzilani miyad ha'ari umiyad hadov, God who has saved me from the hand of the lion and the hand of the bear, hu yatzilani miyad ha'pelishti hazeh, he will save me from the hands of this Philistine. Another little break you see in the pasuk over there. Does it have it in your books? Yeah, let's see a little break. Vayomed Shaul el David lech. Shaul says to David, okay, you can go. Vadonai yeh imach, and God will be with you. What do you know? So what just happened? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, maybe, like what you brought up, why he doesn't bring up God, and then he does bring up God. Maybe, you need to sell to people the way they want to be sold.
Mm-hmm.
So no one else was worried about Hashem, and no one had that faith in Hashem. So he said, if I go in all religious,
right,
he's gonna say, oh, you're not worth anything.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that said the sentence that he said to Hashem, maybe he said to himself quietly, or he said it, he said it to those who were more interested in that, but he needs to prove his physical prowess, because that's all that matters.
Right.
To Shaul.
So I definitely agree with you when David is initially responding to Shaul's claim, right? What Shaul charged him with was, you're but a young lad and you're not experienced. So David tries to respond to that claim. But to Shaul's credit, I'd like to suggest, to Shaul's credit, notice, remember I pointed out there's a little break, and then Vayomed David speaks again. So I mentioned this in one of my Shabbat speeches, that sometimes the Torah speaks more with silence than it does with words. Little breaks in the chapter are significant. And what you notice here is Shaul does not respond to David's claim about the lion and the bear. He doesn't say anything. There's a little break. And the text is hinting to us that there was a silence on the part of Shaul. He doesn't respond. He's not taken by David's claim. So David pivots. David says again, Vayomed David. That's why it says again, David spoke again. Why does it have to repeat to us Vayomed David? David was the speaker. Nobody spoke in between that would have to repeat Vayomed David. The silence over here speaks volumes, right? The Tanakh is saying more in the silence that Shaul ignored David's claim at that point. He wasn't sold on what he said. Why? Because to Shaul's credit, he wasn't sold on the fact that David didn't present a godly argument. So David pivots and he says, Vayomed David. David again says, Adonai asher hitzilani. Oh no, God who saved me. And to that, Vayomed Shaul el David lech. Shaul says, okay, now you've proven yourself. Now I'm willing to send you. Shaul, to his credit, I believe this speaks a positive about Shaul, because we've said a lot of things that have shown Shaul's shortcomings. But to Shaul's credit, Shaul too knows that the victory against the Pelishti is going to come from God. It's not going to come from the strongest soldier available. That's perhaps why Shaul did not step up to fight, to his credit and also to his detriment. Shaul recognized he did not have God on his side because of his previous missteps. And so despite Shaul's stature and his placement as the king, he does not go to fight a battle because he says, I know I don't have Hashem with me. I'm not going to step in. And he's waiting for somebody who he believes has Hashem on their side to fight. And so when David says that, now Shaul is convinced. So I do think that shows something interesting about Shaul, that he was waiting for that argument and not any other physical argument as well. And we see that David, very Yosef-like, has Hashem on his lips. At first, he's somewhat apologetic of God. He wants to first prove his mettle, but then he sees that's not what Shaul wants. So he goes with the godly argument and he proves that. And that's going to be something that we'll see on David's mouth as we go through the chapter. So David has proven himself spiritually worthy to fight against Goliath, and Shaul is going to let him go. Now, with this in mind, something very interesting happens in the next couple of verses. Watch what happens, a little episode. Vayalbesh, we're in verse 38. Vayalbesh Shaul et David madav. Shaul takes off his armor and places it onto David. He's going to dress David up in armor because Shaul knows he needs the armor to fight against Goliath. He's not just going to send David out there, waiting for a miracle, right? This is a constant philosophical idea that we've said, that even though Shaul recognizes Hashem is going to help, he can't just send him out there with nothing. He needs to be ready for battle. So he's going to dress David in his armor. Venatan kova nechoshet al rosho. He places a bronze helmet on David's head. Vayalbesh oto shiryon, and he dresses him up in his body armor. Vayahgor David et harbo me'al lemadav. He places his sword. Vayahgor is a hagorah, like a belt, because that's the, like Batman carries a utility belt with all this stuff. That's what they do. That's what they use to hold their weaponry. So a hagorah is a belt. He arms David with his sword, me'al lemadav, onto his armor. Vayoel lalechet kilo nisa. These are very interesting words. Vayoel lalechet kilo nisa. What do those words mean? The word vayoel is a hard word to pinpoint. Sometimes vayoel means a person has a burning desire, an attempt. He wants to do something, which would mean over here, vayoel lalechet, David wants to walk in the armor. He tries, but he cannot. Kilo nisa. He's unable to do it. He's unable to walk in this heavy armor. He's not been trained properly in this type of military equipment. Another option is vayoel lalechet, is that he's unable to walk in it. So, in other words, it sounds like David is trying to do something, but he can't. The heaviness of the armor is preventing him from being able to move. Vayomed David el Shaul. David says to Shaul, Lo uchal lalechet ba'eleh. I can't walk in these things. Kilo nisiti, because I have never been trained upon them. I haven't used these before. Vayesirem David me'alav. David, as a result, removes the armor from him. And this is pretty striking, because what's he going to do now? He needs some kind of armor to step into the battle with Goliath. He can't go with no protection, but he tries to wear Shaul's armor and he can't do it. So David wants to go out and fight armorless, which is a death sentence in the eyes of the people. It's very interesting what's going on. Instead, Vayikach maklo biyado, David takes a stick in his hand. Vayivchar lo hamisha haluke avanim. He takes 5 stones, 5 pebbles from Min HaNachal, from the valley. Vayasem otam bechli haroim. He puts them in his shepherd's pouch. Asher lo ubayalkut v'kal'o biyado, that are in his knapsack or whatever pouch he's carrying. And he takes the slingshot in his hands. Vayigash el Pilishtim. He's now going to approach the Pilishti. He's going to approach Goliath to get into a battle with him. Fascinating, right? Just let's pause here at this point in the story. What just happened? What just transpired between Shaul and David? Shaul tries to give him the armor. David puts it on, but he can't walk, so he takes it off. Why is this significant? What's the symbolism? I haven't been trained to it, and I'm not ready for it. So Shaul is kind of handing him over subconsciously the malchut, and David is not maybe ready to handle the heaviness of it, the burden that it has upon him. That's an interesting way of looking at it. The idea that Shaul, I want to emphasize what you're saying, that the idea that Shaul is handing him the armor, dressing him in the armor, is very symbolic, because clothes represent a transition, a changing of the guard, as it were, right? We just read in last week's parasha that when Yosef becomes the viceroy, what is the first thing that Paro does? He gives him the royal garb. When Mordechai becomes king, we dress him, he gets dressed up. It's one of the psukim that we read out loud in the Megillah. Mordechai yatsa milifnei hamelech bilvush malchut. He's wearing the royal garb. Another episode in the Torah is when Aharon is about to die and he wants to appoint his son Elazar as the next Kohen Gadol. The Torah depicts Aharon taking off his priestly garments and dressing his son Elazar in those priestly garments as a sign that Elazar is going to be the next Kohen Gadol, just as Aharon is ready to pass away. So dressing the next person in your clothing is a sign of transitioning to the next phase, of a changing of the guard, as it were. So Shaul, without maybe even realizing it, or maybe he does somewhat realize it, is giving his armor to David to dress him in that armor, right? Which is a sign of him passing the malchut over to David, which he doesn't know David has been crowned king, but he's going to get a sense that this is the key story that puts in his mind that David will take over for him as the king. At the same token, yeah. I was going to say, yeah.
Like Shaul's clothing wasn't the
Yeah.
right clothing.
It's not the right clothing for him. Yeah.
Shaul, like Hashem,
Yeah.
Shaul sort of thought-
If anything, he wants to distance himself from Shaul's armor, right? Shaul's giving him the armor of strength, and David is saying, I'm not so sure that I want my kingdom to be based on the same principles that your kingdom has been based on. In other words, you've promoted the idea of physical strength. Shlomo was Mishichmo Vamala, he was head and shoulders above everybody. We know David is starting on a different path. It's not what you see on the outside, it's what you see on the inside for David's kingdom. So David is saying, I don't know that I want to wear this armor now in this major battle for myself when I'm proving myself and what my kingdom is going to be about. I'm not doing the same things that you're doing. There's not only a physical changing of the guard, there's also an ideological changing of the guard of what this next kingdom is going to really be about. And so that's why he says, Kilon Nisa. I'm not interested in trying the same thing. I want to try a little bit something else. The rabbis say something very interesting about the words Kilon Nisa. Today is Chanukah, so I figured I'd throw this in. The word Nisa also comes from what word? Test, like a nisayon, excellent also. A nes, a miracle, right? Tests and miracles, by the way, have a strong relationship with each other, because what a miracle is it's essentially, really what a nes means. Let me back up. What a nes really is a banner, it's a sign, right? In the Torah, when it says that, excellent, right? The bronze snake, when the Jewish people are having a plague and they're all dying from a plague, what does God say? God says, take a bronze snake, Vesim oto al nes, and put it on a pole. You're going to raise it up, and everyone's going to look at it, and that's how they're going to be healed. That's why the modern day symbol for a medical at a doctor's office is a snake around the staff, right? That's that idea. Why? Because that represents the nechasha nechoshet. Exactly. So he says, I'm looking at this idea, right? I'm putting it on a pole, a nes, right? So a nes is a banner, and we take that and we apply it to a nisayon, a test, because a person who passes a test can hold that up as a banner of their commitment to Hashem. And a miracle also, right? A miracle is the idea of, it's a banner for God. God is showing his existence. So maybe what David is saying over here, some of the rabbis, I think it's the Radak who explains it this way. He said that what David was saying was, I don't want this armor because I don't want it to be a miracle. It wouldn't be enough of a miracle, I should say, right? In other words, David wants to go out without any protection, because he wants everybody to realize that it's obvious that Hashem was the one who helped him to win. If he goes out in his armor, people will say, oh, it was because he had the good armor, he had the right sword, Shaul gave him his thing. They're not going to notice that it was Hashem. David says, I don't want any of this stuff. I just want to go out me in the way that everybody will recognize that it was Hashem who helped me to be victorious. So a fascinating back and forth over here as we're getting deeper and deeper into the chapter and closer to a battle. Let's pick up here on verse 41, right? I think, verse 41, Mem Aleph. Now let's see the engagement between David and Goliath. Vayelech ha'pelishti holech v'karev el David. The Philistine now starts to encroach and walk closer and closer to David. So the two parties are closing in on each other. Where did I go? Yeah. And there was a man who's carrying, right? This is where Malcolm Gladwell said there's an attendant who's leading him onto the floor. There's a man who is leading him out there, who's carrying his weaponry from in front of him. The tzina is the shield. A tzina is a protection. And all of a sudden, the Philistine sees that it's David coming at him with no armor and no weapon. He begins to mock and scorn David. And he says to him, he notices that he's very young, and he's red with a very appealing countenance. What does that have to do with anything over here? That he sees that, right? Obviously, age and youth makes sense. Goliath, is expecting to see a trained older warrior. Instead, he sees a young little shepherd boy, right? So that already is insulting to Goliath, which is why he starts to attack, to mock him.
Just see those three words
Yes, exactly. We did see all those characteristics in last chapter when Shemuel was crowning him as king, and those were the characteristics that Shemuel was wishy-washy about, right? And now those same characteristics are being seen by Goliath, and once again, he's using that to mock. So nobody seems to be enamored by David's physical appearance in any of the situations, even though, by the way, he's good looking. In this situation, what do the rabbis say? Goliath sees him and he's good looking. He says warriors are not supposed to be good looking, right? Warriors are supposed to be buff. They're supposed to have battle scars. They're supposed to be maimed, right? Goliath is probably not a very handsome, attractive man. A warrior is somebody who is strong, has all of the scars of battle. He's rugged. That's not David's exterior, right? Acromegaly is what, it's what Malcolm Gladwell said. Yeah.
We went to Florida last week, and I was in the airport, and I was sitting next to a pilot. I didn't think anything of it. Now they start boarding our flight or whatever, and the guy, the pilot next to me, he said, "There's no places out. They're boarding my plane. I gotta go." So obviously, this is my time. So cool. And I'm like, "Oh, no, you gotta have good eyesight."
Good eyesight.
So cool. Like, oh no.
Yeah. So yeah, this is again not the external appearance that's fit for war. David doesn't seem to find, huh? Exactly. Yeah, exactly. 100%. So nobody has ever seen David in the setting like that's fitting for what they want, right? Again, his external appearance doesn't fit so far with any of the scenes that we've seen him in, except maybe shepherding, and that's really why everybody wants to keep him, right? Just remain a shepherd, right? Yeah, he's coming with the stick and the thing. David's going to say, look, I'm going to use what tools I have. I'm going to use what's good for me. Vayomer hapelishti il David. So the Philistine says to David, Hakelev anochi, what am I, some kind of dog? Ki ata ba elai bamaklot, that you're coming at me with sticks. By Kalel hapelishti et David belohav, and the Pelishti curses David with his God. In other words, he's doing really, really tough stuff in terms of his speech. Now, David does a very good job over here of hiding his intentions. This I do agree with Malcolm on the point. David does not want to give away what he's about to do. If David comes and his slingshot is visible and his rocks are visible, Goliath will figure out immediately what he's doing, and that shield and whatever it is will be there to protect him. So there is a little bit of a, what do they call it? A game of cat and mouse over here between David and Goliath. David is coming and he's hiding his intentions. He conceals his weaponry in a way that Goliath will not figure out what he's about to do until it's too late. Because so David is, yes, coming in the name of God, as we'll see in a minute, but also strategically plotting how he's going to do this in a way that will be best successful. David, yeah, he was trying to use the element of surprise. Definitely another tool in his bag. The Philistine says to David, Lecha elai, come to me. And I will feed your flesh. I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and to the beasts of the field. Now we're going to read a part that, in my opinion, is the key to understanding this whole chapter. It'll be obvious. It's one that Malcolm leaves out, and this is why I think that has to be rooted into what he's talking about. Because everything that he said, I believe, could be true, and maybe is true, but this is really the centerpiece of what the Tanakh wants to teach us. It's this speech now that David says to Goliath right before he's about to attack him. David says to the Philistine, you're coming at me with a sword and spear and javelin and all this weaponry and a helmet. So now you understand why David didn't want to take that armor, because it would ruin this climactic moment that he's about to have. Says, you're coming at me with all this weaponry. But I'm coming at you with the name of God, host of legions. Elohim Ma'archot Yisrael, the God of the legions of the Jewish people. Asher Herafta, who you have scorned and mocked and cursed. Hayom hazeh yisagircha Adonai biyadi. This very day, God is going to deliver you into my hands. V'hikiticha, I'm going to smite you. V'hasiroti et roshecha me'alecha, and I'm going to remove your head from your body. He already predicts that, David. V'natati peger machane pelishtim hayom hazeh, and I'm going to bring the carcasses of the Philistines on this day. Le'of hashamayim ul hayat haaretz, to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the land. So he's using Goliath's own words against him. V'yedeu kol haaretz. This is key. David says, what's going to happen as a result? All the land will know, not just us, but all the land will know that there's a God who is watching over the Jewish people. And more so than that, look what David says at the end, because remember, David was not particularly taken by the fact that none of the Jews stepped up to do this, right? He was particularly upset that they were allowing such cursing and behavior on Goliath's part to take place. He says in verse 47, and also this whole congregation, he's talking about the Jewish people will know, because apparently their faith had weakened. That it is not with the sword or the javelin that God brings salvation. For to God is war, and he will put you into our hands. An impassioned speech, and really the key point of emphasis in this whole chapter is that line. David says, yes, I'm coming to you without a sword. That's what I want, because everyone should know that it's not with the sword. We shall soon see, we've already seen, by the way, but we shall continue to soon see that one of the hallmarks of Shaul's kingdom is the sword. Shaul, in a previous chapter, chapter Yud Gimel and Yud Daled, remember, think back into your memories when they were engaging with war against the Philistine, and the Philistine did not allow the Jewish people to do what? To have any weapons. Excellent, Esther, right? They did not let them to have any weapons. They did not allow any blacksmiths to make swords or spears or any weaponry. Who was the only person who was allowed to have a weapon? Shaul. Shaul was the king, had a weapon. The Pasuk tells us that when Shaul was ready to fight against the Philistine the first time, 3 chapters ago, it says all his people, nobody had any weaponry except for Shaul. And that's the irony of this whole thing. Shaul always has a weapon. We're going to see consistently in the next chapters, every time Shaul is mentioned, he's mentioned with his sword. He's going to try to use his sword to kill David. And then eventually dies by falling on his own sword, right? The sword is what kills him, right? And so the irony of the twist is Shaul, to a certain degree, is Goliath-like. He believes in the power of the sword. He believes in the power of the weaponry. And David is trying to show him and everybody else, it's not what it's about. It's about your relationship with Hashem. It's about your devotion to God, because God is the one who will make you win no matter what. Who was the only other person so far that we've seen who recognized that you can win despite everything else? Not Shaul, but no, Yonatan. Remember Yonatan, Shaul's son?
Yes.
He had a very similar statement. If you want to go, if you double back to chapter 14, his statement is eerily similar to David's over here. When Yonatan decides to fight against the whole Philistine camp by himself in the dead of night. You remember that? When he made that whole deal and the sign of what they're going to say and so on and so forth. Yeah, they come or they don't come. What did he say? He said the following. Yonatan, I'm looking at page 667. It's chapter 13, verse 6. He says, maybe God will perform a miracle for us. There's nothing that blocks or stands in the way of God. To have salvation, whether with many or with few. Yonatan and David share this deep emunah in Hashem and his ability to have victory, no matter what the circumstances might be. It's all throughout Tehillim, for sure. You see that sentiment, yeah. We say it every day. Ele bareche ve'ele basusim. They do it with chariots and with horses. It's us with the name of God is what we do. There's another one we say on Shabbat. Sheker hasus l'tshu'a uvrov haylo lo yimalet. That the sus, the horse is sheker. It's false. It's an illusion, right? The majority of the soldiers that you have, not going to make a difference. It's all about people who are connected to God. Those who wait for God's kindness. This sentiment is shared by David HaMelech all throughout the book of Tehillim. That it's not about power. It's not about strength. It's all about your relationship with Hashem. So David and Yonatan share this sentiment. Shaul has often shared it, but not fully embraced it at times, right? And that's why Shaul stumbles and has stumbled several times. Yeah. This is the thanks of the IDF, right? That how they go in. Yeah. People who have served in the IDF will tell you that that's what they truly feel. Unfortunately, not everybody feels it. Not everybody feels it. But yeah, 100% that it's a sentiment that should be shared. And for religious Jews, that's part of the reason why, in my opinion, I'll insert a little bit of my own philosophy. It's why it's deeply painful for me that not enough religious Jews serve in the army. The army is a tough place to be a religious Jew. You can't take that away. I've had friends who have served, colleagues who have served, and it's a hard place to be a religious Jew. It tests your faith and what you see, but you want more religious people, not less religious people. This is why it's hard for me to accept what many great rabbis, I mean, again, and far be it from me to disagree, but many great rabbis have said, no, the religious people should be exempt from battle and they should study Torah. I have a hard time with that. It's a conflict based on what we're reading here, that we want more religious people fighting, not less religious people. I don't want the secular people fighting on my behalf who don't believe in God. Our victory and our ability to fight off our enemies is dependent on our faith in Hashem. I want more religious people fighting. That's what I want. But yeah, not everybody shares those sentiments. We don't feel this point of divide here, but if you you live in Israel, that's like, it's a tremendously dividing issue for Jews living in Israel. Yeah. So this is what I think this chapter is all about. And we'll see consistently, Shaul is associated with the sword and David distances himself from the concept of the sword. You'll see it come up again later in the chapter. So David wants to also show not just the world, but his own people about what's going on. Let's go to verse 48. Yeah, go ahead.
Like where someone's talking to an enemy and predicting so you can see exactly how the name of Hashem is going to.
It's a good question. I don't know that I'm versed enough. I guess you have to reread everything with that thought process in mind. I definitely feel as though David's words over here are with divine inspiration. There's no question. From this point on, David is acting. God is acting through David. I definitely think that David would say, I'm going to cut off your head. And that's exactly what's about to take place. When, by the way, David is not coming with a sword. So you're wondering, how in the world is David going to chop off his head without a sword? Yeah, the irony is he's going to use Goliath's own sword to chop his head off, right? But the fact that David predicts that and says it that way shows you his connection to Hashem, no question about it. Yeah. Yeah. Why the space where? Mm-hmm. Well, I think there it's to illustrate the different the speaker. First was Goliath, and now David takes his moment to have his speech. I think that's where the break in the text there is. Verse 48. And it was that when the Philistine got up and he approached against David quickly, so as not to ruin the element of surprise, not give himself away, runs. He runs towards the Philistine. And you got to imagine the Jewish people are like, what in the world is he doing? If you're watching this and you have no idea what he's doing, you're seeing an unarmored young boy run towards Goliath. It doesn't make any sense. But now, David then stretches his hands to his pouch. And he takes from there a stone. And he puts it into the slingshot. First shot, boom. He hits the Philistine right in his forehead. Now remember, David took 5 stones, right? Which is almost like David anticipated, what if I miss, right? He took 5 stones just in case he missed, because he thought about that possibility. But right away, first shot, he doesn't even need the other 4. And the stone sinks into the forehead of the Philistine. This sounds almost miraculous that it should hit him and go penetrate directly through his skull. And he falls down flat on his face. Now, a lot of interesting things are happening here because the rabbis notice he falls on his face. What's strange about that? He would expect him to fall backwards from the impact of the fight, but instead he falls flat. It could be the armor that maybe led him that way. The rabbis see in here a little bit of a miracle. They say that his head fell forward to make it easier for David to cut off his head because he was closer to his head. He didn't have to go further there. Other rabbis see that he wanted him to fall flat on his face to cover up his mouth, almost as a sign for the mouth that cursed God, it should be midah keneged midah. His mouth got buried in the ground. He's walking into the valley, so it's possible that he has a little bit of that trajectory. Yeah, that is possible. That is possible. Also, the armor thing, I think, also makes a lot of sense. But the rabbis see a deeper... We need another TED Talk to figure that one out, right? How it works out. But I think the rabbis see not only a physical thing happening here, but also a symbolic thing that's happening here to him. Some rabbis, that Adak, I believe, says, why wouldn't Goliath had this armor, this helmet, why wouldn't his helmet cover his forehead, right? Strange, right? He hit him in the forehead, and the metzach, you would expect that a warrior's forehead would have been covered. So some rabbis say that when he said to David, I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds of the sky, what did he do? He looked up, and that exposed his forehead for a moment, and boom, David hit him right then and there with the stone. So a couple of different images that the rabbis are painting over here as far as what's taking place. Nevertheless, David is clearly being helped by Hashem and is able to smite the Pelishti in one shot. Verse 50. David bested the Philistine with his sling and stone. And he hits the Philistine and kills him. There's no sword in the hand of David. So if you didn't get the message about the sword idea, the text reiterates it again. David beat this gigantic person with just a sling and stone, unassuming weaponry, and he didn't have a sword in his hand. So what does he do to chop off his head? David runs quickly to stand by the Pelishti. He takes the sword of Goliath, and he takes it out of its case, and he slices his head off, and he kills him. And he chops off his head. And the Pelishtim see that their strong warrior has been killed, and they flee. Now, why is that interesting that they flee?
So many of them, they could have fight.
Maybe they could have fought, but clearly, remember back to the beginning of the chapter, what was the deal?
Oh, it was
One-on-one, and whoever wins.
Yeah, but when were they ever ethical?
Right. So that's what the text is coming to tell us about the unethical behavior right here of the Pelishtim, because this is not how we would expect the aftermath to be. The deal was whoever loses, they're going to become servants to the other people. They're going to be submissive to them. What do the Pelishtim do? They run away. The minute they run away, what did they show? They would never, not only didn't they keep the bargain, they never really were willing to keep the bargain. Why not? Because they never thought in a million years that they'd lose. It's one of those, like a gambler who puts up the money, but thinks that they're going to win no doubt. Once you take that money, they want that money back, right? They don't really want to give up on it. The Pelishtim never really made that deal in good faith, because they never thought in a million years that they would lose, that Goliath would be defeated. So they run away. Once they run away and break the deal, that gives license for the Jewish people now to chase them and kill them, because they broke the deal. And hence the next pasuk in verse 52, Vayakumu anshe Yisrael v'Yehuda. When the Jews see that they're running away and not keeping the deal, oh, they don't like that. They get up and they chase after them. Vayariu, they blow the shofar and they have their battle cries. Vayirdefu et Pelishtim ad bo'acha Gai, and they chase after the Pelishtim all the way to Gai. The ad sha'are Ekron, and to the gates of Ekron. Ekron are the gates of the Pelishtim land. Vayipelu chalele Pelishtim bederech she'arayim. And the slain, the mortally wounded of the Pelishtim fall in spades all the way up to Sha'arayim, ve'ad Gad, ve'ad Ekron. So it's a massive victory for the Jewish people after the Pelishtim flee. Vayashuvu b'nei Yisrael midelok ahare Pelishtim, vayashosu mahanehem. The Israelites return from chasing the Pelishtim and they loot their camp, because basically the Pelishtim have forfeited their camp, which was on Jewish territory, and the Jews have pushed them back, and now that territory is going to belong to the Jewish people, and they take everything from the camp. Vayikach David et rosh Pelishti. David takes the head of Goliath, and he saves it for posterity. Vayviehu Yerushalayim. He brings it to Jerusalem. Ve'et kelav sam be'aholo. And his weaponry he holds onto in his tent. Now, important to note over here, I like Rabbi Amnon Bazak's explanation. He says this pasuk is not talking about now. It's actually a pasuk that is talking about a later time. How does he know? because the city of Yerushalayim does not belong to the Jewish people at this point. It belongs to one of the Canaanite people, the Yevusi. Eventually, David will conquer and take hold of Yerushalayim later in his kingship, and that is when he will bring the head of Goliath to Yerushalayim. So here, the pasuk is not chronological. The pasuk is foretelling of something that will happen later on. Eventually, when David takes hold of Yerushalayim, he will bring the head of Goliath to Yerushalayim, and he will take the weaponry of Goliath and he'll place them in his tent, right? We will see that Goliath's weaponry will come up a little bit later on in the story of Nov. So it's likely that really where David placed the head of Goliath and the Kilim was in another place, Nov, until he eventually conquered Yerushalayim and then moved it there at a later time period. And the text is telling us about the eventual resting place of Goliath's head and his warfare and his weaponry, not what exactly happened right at this moment. But the idea is that David holds on to these things as a source of strength for himself and for the rest of the Jewish people, almost like a symbol. Never forget the battle that Hashem conducted here and the help that he gave to David to destroy the mighty Goliath. And so this story stands consistently for a message of strength with Hashem over any type of physical strength that anybody may come with. Questions, thoughts, ideas over here? Okay, very good. There was one other thing. No, I think we're ready to wrap up the chapter. Yeah, go ahead.
So I know you've said in the past something, and I don't remember the reasons why, that's why I'm confused, that they're allowed to take the spoils of the war. But now they did take the spoils. So
Yeah.
They were allowed, but how come the other times they weren't?
It's a good question about spoils. Sometimes spoils are off limits because you don't want it to muddle the victory, right? That we were really fighting a religious battle more than a political or monetary gainful battle. In this case, because I think the Philistine broke the deal, because they were really supposed to be the servants, the text tells us the Jews were allowed to benefit from it and they took it and they were justified in doing so because the Philistine broke the deal. So under some circumstances, we're not allowed, but under other circumstances, we are. I think these were one of those circumstances that we were allowed. Now, the chapter ends with one of the most bizarre conversations in all of the Tanakh, given everything that we know before. And many, many rabbis, commentaries have attempted to understand what is going on over here. We'll try to make sense of it on our own, but we should know going into it, it's an incredibly confusing little section. So David just stepped up to the plate. He defeated Goliath. And now watch what happens. I'm in verse 55. Shaul et David yotze lekrat ha'Pelishtim. As Shaul, so now we're going like a little bit back in time, as Shaul sees that David is going out to fight the Philistine, Amar, he says, El Avner Sar HaTzava, to Avner, his head general, Ben mi zeh hana'ar Avner. Avner, whose son is this? In other words, who is this boy's father? Vayomer Avner, Avner says, I swear on my life to the king, im yadati, if I should know who this is. In other words, Avner says, I got no clue. Vayomer HaMelech, the king says, She'ala ata, you go around and ask, Ben mi zeh ha'alim, whose son this is. The boy, ha'alim is another word for a na'ar, a young lad. Ben mi zeh ha'alim, this young lad, whose son is he? Who's his father? Now, this is incredibly strange. Why is it strange? David, of course, Shaul knows who David is. Yeah, that Shaul. Yeah, what are you talking about? This is a ridiculous question on the part of Shaul. Shaul has an intimate relationship with David. He's been his harp player and his arms bearer. Which, by the way, it's kind of strange why David wasn't on the battlefield to begin with, given that he was his arms bearer. So, okay, David had the double jobs. He was supposed to be the shepherd also, I understand. But it took David time to actually make his way to Shaul before, right? And now it seems like Shaul doesn't know who this guy is. What do you mean you don't know who he is? And when he was described to Shaul in the previous chapter, he was described as the son of Yishai. And in fact, Shaul sent word back to Yishai after he decided to hold on to David. By the way, I just want you to know I'm holding on to your son. So what is he asking over here? Whose son are you? What does that mean? It's a very strange question. And Avner, who probably also knows, says, how should I know who's his father? I have no clue.
And he's also the army general. He should know who the arms bearer is.
You should know everything. No, it's completely incomprehensible by the simple meaning of the text what exactly is happening over here. Now, to make matters worse, let's read the last two Pesukim as well. Verse 57, nobody can find out. When David returns from defeating the Pelishti, Avner grabs him and takes him in front of Shaul, and the head of the Philistine is in his hand. Verse 58, Shaul says to him, whose son are you? David says, Ben Avdecha Yishai Bet Talachmi. David responds, he says, I'm the son of Yishai from the town of Bethlehem. What in the world is going on over here? It's completely incomprehensible what is taking place in this conversation between David and Shaul. So the rabbis tried to understand it by saying that there was something else going on underneath. Would you say that? So one option could be that the ruach ra'ah that has come onto Shaul maybe has caused him to have some form of an amnesia.
Like not just amnesia, sort of like because he goes after him later, almost like he has, he doesn't know.
Yeah, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's kind of lost on it. But I think the rabbis have a hard time with that. They're not willing to accept that right away. It's not a great explanation. Thoughts?
You look like this simple guy from this simple father, and it's obviously more to the story. So they technically know who he is and who his father is, but they're like, wait, there is more going on here that doesn't meet the eye.
So, Julie, what you're suggesting, if I can add to your words, is that what he was asking was, like, what zehut do you have? What merit do you have? Which in Shaul's eyes had to have come from his ancestry, like his father and his grandfather. Like, what merit do you have to have been able to withstand such a terrifying ordeal and come out victorious? It's got to be, in other words, the question was not literally who's your father, but more like what zehut do you have? Where do you come from that you should have been able to be successful in this area? Huh? So one of the rabbinic comments, the rabbis say that Yishai was amongst some of the people who never sinned, right? And that he was a great man in and of himself. And the rabbis have a lot of statements about the greatness of Yishai, which the greatness of Yishai is kind of lost within the simple text over here. Right. I'm Yishai's son. So that kind of, like you're saying, turns a light bulb on in Shaul's eyes of why he's able to. But Shaul still could have figured that out for himself, right? He didn't need to find that out. So Rashi and Radak and Abarbanel and all the major classical commentaries on the Tanakh over here adopt the rabbi's interpretation that they bring in the Gemara in Masechet Yebamot, page 76b. Daf Ayin Zayin, Ayin Vav Amud Bet, Ayin Zayin Amud Av. What do the rabbis say? They say, you know what Shaul wanted to know? He wanted to know not about David and his father. He wanted to know about David's lineage, where David came from. Why does he want to know about that? Because David's lineage was a point of major controversy at that time. Why was he a major controversy? Because he descends from Ruta Moaviyah. He descends from a Moabite, whom the Torah says, Lo yavo Amoni u'Moavi b'kal Hashem, that no member of the nation of Ammon and Moab may enter into the Kahal of Hashem.
So he's knocking him out as a royal threat because his blood is not
Right.
royal.
So what the rabbis say happened over here was Shaul figured out at this point that David could be his successor. And what Shaul wants to know is, should he view David as a threat to his throne? Can it be that David will take over the throne? So the first thing the rabbis say he asked was, he knew that David came from the tribe of Yehudah. But there are two major pathways that you can come from the tribe of Yehudah. You can either come from the lineage of Peretz, or you can come from the lineage of Zerach. Now, who are those two people? Let's back a little bit. Right, last week, 2 weeks ago's Parashat Vayeshev. Yehudah impregnates his daughter-in-law, Tamar. After Tamar's two husbands, the other two sons of Yehudah, die. Yehuda is reluctant to give his third son Shelah to Tamar. Tamar dresses up, disguises herself, and conceives twins with Yehuda himself. And Yehuda accepts them eventually in the whole ordeal. And who are those twins? Peretz and Zerah. Two different pathways of the lineage of Yehuda. And those are the ones that we care a lot about. Interestingly, which of those two sides is the greater side? In our rabbis, Peretz. Peretz is where the Mashiach will descend from. Peretz means to break open, to breach. So Shaul understands if he's from the lineage of Peretz, he can breach the walls of the kingship and he can enter to become king. If he's from the lineage of Zerah, Shaul does not see him as a threat. So he wants to know from which lineage does David descend. This is how our rabbis look at it. Eventually, that Avner does not know. And that Shaul himself may not know, because now he's got to go back several generations, which Shaul may not be aware of. That's a more appropriate question. Eventually, David tells him, I'm from Yishai, and notice he adds in the words, Bet Halachmi, from the house of Bethlehem, which is a key to Shaul to understand he's from the family of Peretz. And when Shaul hears that, he knows that David could be the next person in line to get the throne. In the interim, the rabbis put in a whole ordeal that happens here. In the interim, as Shaul is asking about which family of Yehuda he comes from to see if he's worthy to be the king, a man by the name of Doeg HaAdomi, who we will encounter later in the story, says to Shaul, you're asking whether or not he's from this family or that family. Why don't you ask whether he's Jewish even? Ask if he's even allowed to be a part of the Jewish people, because he descends from Ruth. And this strikes up an entire chaos within the people of, is David a legitimate Jew? Which is like a crazy thing to even bring up, right? Because we have taken David, it's for granted. But the rabbis actually had a major conversation of, is David a legitimate, viable Jew in that he descends from Ruth HaMoaviyah? And the rabbis went back and forth and back and forth. And how does the conversation eventually end? It ends by saying that there is an accepted tradition from Shemuel and his court that the prohibition against Moabites and Ammonites is only on the males, not on the females, and therefore David is a legitimate Jew. And that's part of the background to this story, because we know Shemuel is the author of this book, is he wants to prove David's righteous lineage. And that's also one of the reasons the rabbis say he wrote the book of Ruth. Same thing, all to justify David's lineage and why he's worthy to be the next king to take over after Shaul. So the rabbis say that that's what's going on in this very odd conversation, this back and forth between Shaul and Avner and David. And what are they trying to figure out? They're trying to figure out from which family of Yehuda he descends and from whether he's a legitimate Jew based on halakha, which the answer to both of those questions is yes. He's from the family of Peretz, worthy of the throne, and he's a legitimate Jew from Ruth HaMoaviyah because it doesn't apply to the females. And now that Shaul realizes this, he knows that David is a threat to his malchut. And now's where Shaul's relationship with David is going to take on a very different approach. It's going to pivot now because David is clearly the threat and the next person who Shaul sees is in line for his throne. What's going to be so fascinating is the next chapter is going to open that right at this moment, who does David become connected with? With Yonatan, Shaul's son, who Yonatan should really be the next king, but instead it's going to be David. David and Yonatan create this bond, as we noted, based on their philosophy and their outlook on life. And Shaul is going to turn on David, and we're going to see how that storyline goes ahead and progresses. So fascinating things are ahead for us as the entire story now shifts as a result of David and Goliath. Any questions or thoughts or ideas?
So that it wasn't his choice to say, "Oh, I'm going to take over." It's all from Hashem.
Right. But by the way, I want to just finish with one idea. Remember when Shaul put the armor on David? So the rabbis say that something fascinating happened. This is more of a midrash. They say that a miracle took place and the armor of Shaul fit David. Right. It fit David. What was even the thought process, the rabbis say, that Shaul was going to clothe David in his armor? Shaul was known to be much taller, much different build than David. What happened was Shaul put the armor on him and miraculously it fit. And when that happened, Shaul started to get like a spook thing, and he started to realize. So that's why David says, I don't want this, take it off, right? Because David does not want to draw the ire of Shaul to him. But that's inevitable because after he wins the battle, he still has that ire drawn to him. We're going to see how their relationship sort of progresses.